Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 9th, where I wanted to transition us from speech number 1, the autobiographical speech, to upcoming speech number 2. That happens to be the informative speech. As you know, I've asked you to upload your speech number 1, your autobiographical speech, and to please send me your outline for speech number 1 to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. So if you have not sent me your outline yet, please do so because I will need your outline in order to evaluate your speech. So what I will be doing is reviewing your speeches and using the template that I included in our syllabus and other documents material. That said, I don't even use the template for the second speech or the third speech. I just take notes and indicate strengths and weaknesses. But for this first speech, I wanted us to have a little bit of structure. So I'll be getting that back to you to your email. And in terms of you're watching your peer speeches, because that's the second part of the exercise, I am going to ask, in lieu of today's attendance question, that you watch all of the speeches of your peers and that you send me privately via email a strength and weakness for each of the speeches that you watch. What I'll be doing is compiling all of that data and making that available to the class the next time that we meet. The next time that we meet is not necessarily going to be next week because next week is spring break. So we're in an unusual place in the academic semester because normally you would have 48 hours to do your attendance question, or in this instance, to watch the speeches of your peers and send me feedback. But that would mean that you would have a deadline of Saturday, which puts us into spring break, and I didn't want to do that. So I can't necessarily do this for the second or the third speech because we don't have holidays after the second or the third speech, but we do have this holiday after the first speech, so I can give you a bit of extension as to when you could submit in that feedback to me. You can submit it up to the ending of spring break, which would be Sunday, March 19th, 11:59 p.m. via my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. Again, I ask that you send me one strength and one weakness of each of your peer speeches, which you can access at the top of our Moodle page in the folder for speech number 1, which is where you uploaded your own speech. So while you are doing that, I would also ask you to at least contemplate the idea of our second speech. Now that you've had the experience of putting into practice much of what the textbook and I have suggested in terms of delivering speeches, and also now that you've had the opportunity to introduce yourself to the class, and also after you watch your peer speeches to hear a little bit about your classmates, we move forward to the informative speech. So this is a longer speech. This is a 10-minute speech. So it's double the time, where you will be teaching your audience something. And there are lots of different ways that you could go about this particular informative speech. The other way that this speech is different is that I'm going to be asking you to use an audio and visual. And that said, I stopped counting after 1, so you can choose any audio or visual that you'd like. And in fact, I'm going to cover some of the possibilities for audio and visuals, much like the reading that I had assigned for today covered that as well. I know that you could have elected to do something like that for the first speech, but you weren't required to do that for the first speech because I wanted you to focus on the basics of speech delivery for speech number 1. But now that you've had some experience with the basics, I wanted to add an additional layer. So that would be using some sort of audio or visual. Now, you can use as many as you'd like, but again, I stopped counting after 1. So your job in the informative speech is to teach us something. And if you're using the edition of the textbook that I had ordered for our class, on page 196, they give you some ideas of things you could discuss. You can talk about famous people. You can talk about places. You can talk about things. You can talk about events. You can talk about procedures. You can have a speech that is an explanation that basically tells us, or you can have a speech that's a demonstration that basically shows us, or a combination of the two. And there's strengths and weaknesses to both speeches, so it's not as if one is better than another, but I can give you some suggestions for both. Limit your points, because you've got only 10 minutes, and we've already established that most people have pretty poor listening skills, and they also have pretty poor memory skills. Use transitions. Find a way to connect one idea to the next. Avoid jargon. Specialized language that's associated with a particular discipline. So you are delivering your speech to a general audience. Cluster like ideas. It's one of the ways that we tend to remember things, is that we tend to group things into categories. Associate old ideas with new ideas. It's something that educators oftentimes do. You might have seen this done in something like a math class, for instance, where you talk about the older principles first and then you build on those. Use repetition. That's one of the ways to help an individual remember information, is by repeating it. And when you're speaking, you're probably more likely to use repetition than you would be than when you are writing. Address different learning styles. People tend to learn differently. Some people learn best through hearing, orally. Some people learn best through reading, visually. Some people learn best through doing, tactile. And if you've made it this far in the educational system, you probably learn very well through audio and through visual, because those are the primary modes that are used in education. If you're using a technique to try to help your audience remember, you're probably remembering that audiences need multiple learning modes addressed. So it's one of the reasons why teachers, in addition to talking, will oftentimes use something like a whiteboard, or in my instance, the notes below our video, to reinforce some of the major concepts, again, so that you can see them visually as well as hear them from an auditory perspective. And motivate your audience. Sometimes your audience already has motivation to learn about the topic. Sometimes they don't. I believe I shared with you the example of the speech that I had heard about the Heimlich maneuver that had been planned by one of my students years ago. And it was a simulation of somebody actually choking, and no one was aware that it was a simulation. This had happened at the tail end of our break from a 3-hour class, an evening class. And then it turns out that the speaker, who was next assigned to speak, pretended to perform the Heimlich maneuver on the, quote, choking student, unquote. Out popped a rolled ball of paper. And as we were staring at this very surreal sight, the person who had performed, or had seemingly performed, the Heimlich comes calmly to the front of the room and announces that what we had just seen was a simulation. But if it had been real, would we have known how to perform the Heimlich maneuver, which was the subject of that day's class's speech? And it was brilliant in many respects, because the topic might be considered to be a bit dull and a bit dry. But now all of a sudden, the speaker had made it very relevant to the audience by having someone seemingly choke. So all of us were very invested in it. I teach a class in Shakespeare, and I know that motivation is huge, and that people tend to be somewhat suspicious of Shakespeare and may be in the class because they need to satisfy a requirement, not necessarily because they have an inherent interest in the subject matter, which is perfectly fine. And I have approximately 16 weeks to try to motivate and encourage this audience that there is something of value to the course besides satisfying a requirement. That regardless of one's course of study, there are useful elements in the course that it can be transferred over into other areas. I think about some speeches that I think of as public service speeches. I've heard of many speeches where we are taught things like fire safety, for instance. And again, the idea is that hopefully there is some motivation already present within the audience. I remember a speech I had heard from a student about skin cancer, and actually they showed some visuals. And one of the students in the class had asked a question afterwards about one of the visuals, because it turns out that one of the audience members had a mole on their skin that was very similar to one of the visuals that the speaker had shown us about skin cancer. And the speaker, of course, said that they weren't a doctor, but they recommended that the student see a doctor. And the student did, and everything was fine. But can you imagine if it hadn't been fine? And this could have been a life and death situation. You just don't know. So I've heard many informative speeches over the course of my career. Again, some of them are very serious. Again, speeches like how to perform CPR, do the Heimlich maneuver, fire safety. Some of them have been much more relaxed. You can teach us how to do something. I've heard speeches about how to bake the perfect chocolate chip cookie, for instance. Food tends to be very popular, especially when you're doing something in person, because you can share samples. Now, of course, we have the limitations of video because this is an online class. So you're obviously not going to be able to share samples. But you are going to have to think ahead a little bit about how you would do a demonstration without necessarily having an audience participating. You could demonstrate for us. If you've ever seen a cooking show, you perhaps know exactly what I'm talking about. And that requires a lot of preparation ahead of time. You want to have all of the ingredients ready and so forth. And you do have to think about the timing, because once you start to do things like demonstrations, the time disappears, and you want to keep it within the 10-minute frame. So, I remember hearing a speech about how to buy a used car. This was from a used car salesman. In a former life, he had been a used car salesman. Let me tell you, the audience was listening with rapt attention, taking notes furiously. The speaker actually, after they finished their speech, there were so many questions that actually we had to end it. And the speaker continued to answer questions during the break, just as a kind of public service. I remember one speech where actually, again, this was an in-person class. It was delivered outdoors, and we were shown how to change the oil in our car. Again, a lot of prior preparation had to be done, as well as having a backup plan in the event of inclement weather. But it was summertime, and we had a lovely day, and it worked quite nicely. So there are lots of different ways that you can go about this informative speech. What I recommend is that you think about things that you already have some knowledge about. That is a time saver. If you already know something that you can transfer over into a public speaking situation. Also think about former assignments that you've done. Have you written any informative papers, for instance, that could be adapted for something like this particular speech? Also think about what you're learning about in class. Perhaps there's something in class that you're learning about that you might want to share with us. Much like I did previously with the autobiographical speech, after the break I will be showing you some sample informative speeches from students like yourselves, in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day your speech will be highlighted in one of my classes. But this can give you an idea about how one could proceed with an informative speech. Now, in terms of visual aids, again, the purpose of the visual aid is to help, or the audio aid is to reinforce the information. And you can go low tech, you can go high tech, you can go someplace in between. So it could be as low tech as something like a poster. Again, you've got to think about scale. How easily will the audience be able to see it? How would you incorporate it? I personally like handouts. This works very nicely in an in-person situation where you want your audience to walk away with something. Oftentimes it could be either complex or sensitive material that you don't necessarily think that the audience would feel comfortable writing about. For instance, you might give the website and phone number for a suicide hotline, and instead of just writing it on a whiteboard, you might distribute it in a handout so that there's a certain level of privacy involved when everybody receives their handout. And if you're concerned about paper usage, you can even encourage individuals to recycle or to give the handout to somebody who might be in need. Pictures work very nicely, particularly for appealing to people's emotions. And we tend to be emotional creatures, even though we also tend to be, or at least attempt to be, intellectual creatures as well. And again, you have to think about how are you going to be able to show that picture so that it is visible to your audience. And obviously, the way that you would display that picture to an in-person audience would be different than to an online audience like this one. And you can also use props. Again, you must think about scale. And will we be able to see the prop? Do you want us to interact with the prop if we're meeting in person? Obviously, online, we can't interact with the prop, but you can interact with the prop, which was one of my critiques of the sample informative speech, or the sample autobiographical speech, I should say, about I Want to Be a Millionaire. That, yes, it was good that that speaker used a prop, but they didn't really interact naturally with that prop. They were quite stiff. You can use a video clip. You can use an audio clip. And again, you have to think about balance. The idea is that any audio or visual supplements your speech. It doesn't substitute for your speech. So you wouldn't want to show a video clip that's 9 minutes long for a 10-minute speech, because obviously that's taking up the bulk of the speech. Now, if you had an hour-long speech, perhaps you could show a video of about 9 minutes. I would say that for a 10-minute speech, you probably wouldn't want to go over 3 minutes or so. And again, because of some of the technological challenges with recording oneself, you'd have to think about how to do this. Whether or not you want to record yourself on Zoom, which is a possibility, and screen share and then upload that onto YouTube and then ultimately share that with the class. Or if you had a screen that you wanted to show while you were also being recorded. So there are lots of different ways to do it. There is no good or bad way. Just keep in mind that the focus of the speech is supposed to be you, not the audio visual. So I've seen, for instance, where individuals have tried to use PowerPoint presentations or Zoom presentations where their image is quite small and then it's the PowerPoint that's very large. It should be the other way around. Your image should be large because this is a public speaking class, and then it could be the PowerPoint that is small. I have no problems with PowerPoint. I think it serves a wonderful, it serves as a wonderful option in the right situation. But if you've ever seen PowerPoint gone bad, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. PowerPoint has been misused and abused since probably the beginning of its creation. The idea of PowerPoint is just to reinforce major words or terms. You're not supposed to put too much text on the slides. Again, we're not supposed to read the slides. We are supposed to be listening to you. So the slides are just there to reinforce. You might have seen PowerPoint presentations where people are reading off of their slides. Definitely you don't want to do that. You want to maintain eye contact with your audience and be conversational, as we've been talking about with speech delivery thus far. You might have seen PowerPoint presentations where there were technological failures. So you always want to be prepared with a backup plan for a technological failure. Again, you've got a different kind of situation perhaps when you're recording, because you can always re-record. This is something that you can't do in a live situation. You have one shot and one shot only. I do remember a presentation I went to. It was actually professional development for faculty and staff many years ago. And it was a Saturday during the summer. It was no small trick to get us all available on a Saturday during the summer. And it was about incorporating computer technology into our curriculum. So these were the early days of computers. And very early on into the presentation, in the first half hour or so, And this was on campus at GCC. GCC lost its electricity. In fact, it turned out that most of Greenfield had lost its electricity, as we found out later. It's very difficult to have a presentation about using computer technology when you can't use computers because there's no electricity. And we couldn't cancel the presentation. Too much effort and too much time had gone into it. So the people who were presenting continued forward. They did actually a terrific job considering the limitations that they had. A lot of what they needed to do was on the fly. They had never anticipated that they would lose electricity, so that at least we had enough natural light through the windows and that we could at least continue in that fashion, but we couldn't obviously use the internet or any of the computers. So I always remember that, and I always tell students you want to make sure that you have a backup plan. Your speaking notes, for instance, I always suggest you have them as a piece of paper, as I do right here. These are my speaking notes that I am posting on the bottom of our videos. So those are literally the notes that I use, as you can see, keywords and phrases. And the reason why I like to have paper is because if I did have these notes on the screen, and if there was a technological failure, I would lose my notes. So at least I can rely on having my notes, which is why you don't want to have your PowerPoint presentation also serve as your notes, because if there's a technological issue and you lose the PowerPoint, well, then you've also lost your speaking notes as well. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a flip chart, and it's a kind of pre-PowerPoint. If you think about it, a flip chart was a large pad of paper that would be placed on an easel in front of an audience, and the speaker would literally flip each page. They would decide when to reveal new pieces of information by flipping the page, which we do electronically with PowerPoint. Though, again, another issue I've seen with PowerPoint is that sometimes the things aren't synced correctly, so that the images aren't necessarily synced with the speaker. Or another issue I've seen with PowerPoint, which I call just because you can, it doesn't mean you should, where people decide that they're going to use every color and every font and every option that PowerPoint affords, and it's just too busy. Remember, the whole point of PowerPoint is to reinforce major points, and it should be very easy for us to read. So you don't want it to be too overwhelming for the audience. So, some suggestions, regardless of what it is that you decide to use for your audio or your visual. Be professional. We expect a certain level of professionalism nowadays. So the days of just scribbling something on a piece of poster board are probably over, unless you can be very, very neat and very, very precise doing such a thing. Always test your equipment beforehand. I always do this before every class. In my in-person classes, I go and I make sure that all of the computer technology is working, the projection system is working, and so forth. Even if I've taught in that classroom earlier on in the day, because again, you don't want any nasty surprises in the moment. Have a backup plan, and it could be something as simple as a whiteboard. Whiteboards work wonderfully if you're having technological issues. You can go old school in that effect. Charts work very nicely for showing numbers. Numbers can be very difficult to visualize and conceptualize. Pictures, as I had indicated earlier, can work very well for emotions. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat in your audio visuals. You want to consider scale and proportion so that we can see what it is that you're showing us. You want to use color for interest, but you don't want to overwhelm us. You want to avoid using all capitals. Certainly you can capitalize an important word. I don't know if you've ever seen a large body of text all in capitals. Unfortunately, I believe every English teacher has received at least one paper in their career that's been submitted in all capitals. And let me tell you, it is incredibly difficult to read. So you don't want to do that. So save it for perhaps to emphasize something. What studies have found, interestingly, that if you really want to emphasize something, for the audience to remember, to pay attention to it, that they're more likely to remember it if it is bolded rather than underlined. So that's something to consider as well. And think about your spelling. And I'm not just saying this as an English teacher. There's nothing worse than highlighting some text where there's spelling errors in it. This is what your audience is most likely to remember, is the spelling error. Now, you're not required to use supporting materials, outside supporting materials for this speech. You will for speech number 3, which happens to be your persuasive speech, which is how we are going to be ending the semester. However, you may want to use supporting materials for your informative speech, depending on how well versed you are on the topic that you happen to be sharing with us. In fact, you might even want to consider your first speech and think about, was there a topic that you mentioned in your first speech that you could turn into an informative speech? I've actually had students who have basically had all 3 speeches connect. So the autobiographical speech might talk about your hobby, which happens to be about playing basketball. And then the informative speech was about how basketball was invented. And then the persuasive speech is about how GCC should institute a basketball team. So you could do something like that, or all 3 speeches can be completely unrelated to one another. That's perfectly fine as well. But if you do need to look up information for your informative speech, then I thought I could at least briefly talk about using supporting material. And again, you will definitely need to look up supporting information for your 3rd speech, your final speech, your persuasive speech, which will be 15 minutes long, and I will be asking you to use at least 3 outside resources. I stop counting after 3. And what outside supporting material does, it increases your credibility and your persuasiveness. It's one of the reasons why it's very useful to use for a persuasive speech. And one of the things that people usually think of with outside resources is that they're going to go onto the wide open internet and they're going to go onto Google or perhaps Wikipedia. I'm not necessarily averse to either one of those. I do the same thing. That said, there are better ways to find information, particularly if you are a student or involved in academia. And this is where I'm going to encourage you to use the GCC library, specifically the GCC library databases. Now, you'll see in the notes below under the supporting materials section that I have a link to the GCC library, though basically anytime you're on the GCC webpage, you'll see that there's a button for the library. They want it to be very accessible for students regardless of where they happen to be on the webpage. And the library offers, well, what you would expect to find in a library. Books. Yes, we still have books. Magazine articles. Yes, we still have magazines. We still have physical copies. But most people are interested in electronic, and I have no problem with that either. And of course, the benefits are that you can oftentimes find very recent information, which is why people usually go to the internet. But anybody can post anything on the internet, which means we have to verify it for accuracy. And that said, if you are using the GCC databases, which yes, you need to use the internet to access those databases, but those databases are not available to the general public. They are subscription-based. And basically that means institutions usually purchase them because they're cost prohibitive usually for individuals. Institutions like schools, like colleges, for instance. In other words, your tuition dollars at work help to pay for things like GCC subscription to the GCC databases. And the reason why they're subscription-based is because these databases hire a staff to review the information that's on the database to verify it. So they've done a lot of the work for you. That said, I always encourage you to verify yourself. Always be skeptical. But there is a certain level of safety in using a GCC database that you would never find on the wide open net. And I had somebody who described it this way, and I'll never forget, that the difference between being on the wide open internet and using a database is the difference between unsafe and safe sex. And that basically unsafe sex or being on the wide open internet would be the same in that you're taking risks. chances are it'll be okay, but anything could happen. And a database or safe sex, there's very little risk. Is there risk? Yes. But something terrible is not likely to happen. And I have yet to find a better description between the distinction between the internet and databases. So, and you can see that the GCC databases are searchable, and also we have specialized databases for particular areas of study, as well as just general databases as well. So a lot of information that has good quality associated with it, that's at your fingertips, that you can use anywhere on campus. But if you're off campus, you need to have an access code, which would be on your ID or your GCC library card. So if you don't have access to that, I encourage you to get access to that. Again, it's one of your benefits as a student. And you'll see the GCC library makes it very easy for you to contact a librarian if you did need to set up something like that. And you can see that they've offered many ways of contacting them, whether it be through email, text, voicemail, social media, telephone, even in person. Yes, that's still a possibility. So, now I know that using outside resources oftentimes leads to a certain level of anxiety, especially in writing classes, because there are many rules that are in place about how to go about documenting your outside resources. Even more complex is that there are different rules for different disciplines. So you might have heard of something like the APA, or the American Psychological Association system of rules, which is something that we use for the sciences. Or you might have heard of the MLA, or the Modern Language Association system of rules, which is something that we use for the humanities. And again, it's quite detailed with what it is you need to do and how you need to document everything. The good news with public speaking is that you don't have to be that precise, because keep in mind that you want to be conversational. So what you want to make sure that your audience is aware of is when you are using information that doesn't belong to you. And it could be as simple as you notifying us of that by using a tag, indicating that you're using an outside resource, saying something to the effect of, according to experts. And then anything that follows that sentence, 75% of individuals interviewed said blah, blah, blah. So the assumption is you didn't do the interview yourself. This is not your original research, because you said according to experts. So the assumption is that this comes from an outside source. And again, if you were writing, you would indicate things like page number and author, and eventually you would indicate things like title and place of publication and publisher. And you don't need to give all of that information when you are giving a speech. That said, you should be prepared to give that information if you are asked a question by your audience. Of course, you don't want to just make up speeches. You want to make sure that you're ethical, which was part of the first speech this semester, or part of the first class, or one of the first classes this semester, was about ethos, maintaining ethics, credibility. So certainly you should have the information. And when we get to the third speech, where you do need to use outside resources, I'm going to ask you to include those resources in your speaking outline so that I can take a quick peek at them. Again, in the real world, no one would look at your speaking outline, but again, this is a workshop situation, so I'll look at your speaking outline and also look at your sources very quickly. And I'm not asking for you to put them in any particular kind of style, so you can use MLA or APA or again, I want this to be useful for the real world, where your average audience member just wants enough information so that they can find the source themselves. So things like author and title and publisher and date are usually more than enough. And it doesn't necessarily matter what order you give that information in to the audience member who might be asking. Questions are also something that are quite tricky in informative speeches that are delivered online. Obviously, if you're working with a live audience, you can decide whether or not you're going to take questions during the speech or ask your audience to refrain until the ending of the speech, and hopefully they would do that. Obviously, we can't interact with an audience when we are speaking to a camera. So you could invite questions and ask your audience members to put questions in the comments section and you can address them. But an even better technique is to try to anticipate the questions that your audience or the average audience member might have and address them in the speech, so that ultimately what you've done is you've tried to satisfy all of the questions that could have arisen. Of course, you can't necessarily anticipate everything, but a good public speaker who's audience-centered and thinking about the needs and the expectations of the audience might consider that there are some typical questions that would likely be asked in terms of this subject matter, and if you can address them in the context of your speech, that would be very useful. Now, what can you use as outside resources? In addition to books and magazine articles and the internet, you can also use interviews. The idea is that the person that you're interviewing has some level of expertise for the subject matter. So they're adding some sort of value to the speech. You're not just interviewing somebody because they happen to be available. And again, you have to think about the ethics of the thing. You want to make sure that you are letting them know that your interview is something that you are going to be using in an academic context. Make sure you get their permission. Make sure you get their permission to share their identifying information. And if you don't, you need to use a pseudonym. Sometimes we use qualitative information. Those are anecdotes or stories. And sometimes we use quantitative evidence, and those are facts, evidence. One is not better than another. It's just a question of which is most appropriate in the situation. Ideally, you use both, I suppose. But since you're giving only a 15-minute speech at the ending of this semester and a 10-minute speech for this informative speech, you may not necessarily be in a situation where you would use both or either, but think about the idea of qualitative or anecdote storytelling. So, the idea of talking about whether or not GCC is a good school, you can gather anecdotes from students who have attended GCC indicating whether they had a positive or a negative experience. And that has a certain level of value, but that also has a certain level of bias associated with it. So perhaps you can get quantitative data about whether or not GCC is a good school, facts. And again, what facts you're going to select in order to determine that it is or isn't a good school. Graduation rates, for instance, GPA, for instance. And again, that can also result in a certain level of bias. It doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, which is why I'm saying that one is not necessarily better than another. They both have a certain amount of value. Just like using primary accounts and secondary accounts. I can't say one is better than another. The primary account is the first-hand eyewitness account. The secondary account is the scholarship that's done, usually based on the primary account. So again, if you wanted to talk about the Iraqi war, well, yes, talking to a soldier who had fought in the Iraqi war makes a certain level of sense because they have personal experience. But they also have bias, and they can also be misrepresentational, or they can also just make mistakes. So the secondary account, those individuals who've studied the Iraqi war and have put together many primary accounts to determine their scholarship about the war, that can be very useful too. But again, somebody who's putting together these secondary accounts may not have personal experience. So it's not that one is better than another. Again, ideally you'd use both. But in a short presentation, you may not necessarily have the option or the ability to use both. I'm only asking for 3 outside resources for your last speech. No outside resources are required for this second speech, the informative speech. But if you do elect to use outside resources because you needed to find out information about the informative topic that you are speaking about, then I hope that this was helpful and useful to you. And we will revisit the idea of using outside resources when we get a little bit closer to the persuasive speech. So next week, as you know, is our spring break. So I will be posting on Moodle just to remind you next Thursday that it's spring break. When we return, what we will be doing on the 23rd is having quiz number 2. So now it's time for another quiz. Very similar to what quiz number 1 was about. 20 questions, mostly short answer, some true, false, and some multiple choice, open book, open notes, based on the information that we've covered in the text and in the videos. And I hope that it's more than just a test to determine whether or not you've been doing the work, but that these are also questions that can help inform your process for putting together your speeches. This is also when I will show some practice student speeches, and also when you should be setting up a consultation with me for your second speech, much like you did with your first speech. And basically, anytime from now until the delivery of that speech, which is going to be on the 30th of March. So basically, any time before the 30th, do contact me. And we can have as much or as little contact as you'd like. This could be, if you'd like, a simple email dialogue about how things are going with your second speech. But if not, it could also be a Zoom appointment if you wanted to, or you could talk to me about your speech, or even present your speech. So you can decide how much or how little interaction you'd like to have with me, but you should all be touching base with me about that second speech. So again, in terms of our attendance question, it's not the traditional form, discussion form question that I usually ask. I'm going to ask you to respond via email to keep a certain level of privacy, to send it to my email. And I'm going to ask you to watch all of the speeches of your peers and to send me one strength and one weakness of each of your peer speeches. I'll compile all of that data together, and then I will present that next class. Not next week because that's spring break, but the week after that, so you can see what your classmates thought about all of the speeches as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on after spring break. Have a good spring break. Take care. Bye-bye.